I think I'll start with the first question about bias. Partly it's the framing that comes down from editors onto the newsroom. Editors take their orders from their editors, and in the case of state media like the BBC, they take their orders from the government. I used to work for BBC Radio Newsroom, writing bulletins and summaries for radios two, three, four, and five during the Second Intifada. And our editors used to have weekly meetings with the Home Office, and that's where they took steers on what language could be used. If we had to talk about Israeli targeted killings instead of assassinations, or if we couldn't mention occupation. Later, when I was at the World Service, the editors took their orders from the World Service, sorry, from the Foreign Office, but the effect was the same. We were effectively shepherded into an Overton window of acceptable opinion and acceptable language. Now, I think at the beginning of October the 7th, Israel was quite successful in framing October the 7th as something unprecedented and unprovoked, something savage and subhuman and incomprehensible in any way other than Hamas equals ISIS. And they kept hammering this message home. It's fundamentally a colonial idea, and particularly in countries with a colonial history like the UK and the US, that was very effective. It sort of rammed home this message: they're not people like us. And that very quickly became that they're not people, and their deaths weren't reported as being of the same value as Israeli deaths. Now, it's not something new. When I was working at the BBC in 2001, I remember at the beginning of the Second Intifada, when the first suicide bombings start, I had to write a script for one of the correspondents, Caroline Hawley, for Radio 5. And, the first question is always, Caroline, so what's the latest? What's the body count? Second question is always, what response can we expect from the Israelis? And the third question, which I wrote into the script, that's the one place where you have some creativity and some ability to broaden the debate. And I just wrote, well, Caroline, what could possibly drive a person to blow themselves up and kill themselves like this for such limited political gain? And my editor actually took the paper out of the printer when it came out, drew a red line through it, and came back and put down on my desk and said, "That's not news." Now, as far as the BBC is concerned, it's not. I mean, it's the context, it's the explanation, it's understanding, which in Reithian terms should be the news, but in terms of the way the BBC works, isn't. Now, in terms of what should be the news for the BBC, it's he said, she said. Now, I'll give you another example of a story I was reporting when it happened, which was the Israel's assassination of the PFLP's leader, Abu Ali Mustafa, also in 2001. Um, After that happened, the PFLP put out a statement saying that they were going to carry out a revenge attack, which would be killing an Israeli official of the same level. And we initially reported that. I wrote the bulletin which reported that, and this was for Radio 4. The Israeli embassy called up to complain about it, and my editor wrung his hands and was actually quite angsty about it, but eventually cut that line. The Israelis had apparently told him that the PFLP statement could contain a coded warning that their operatives would use, and the BBC would be responsible for giving a signal to the PFLP to assassinate someone. We didn't run the PFLP statement. 2 weeks later, they assassinated Rehavim Ze'evi, a far-right Israeli, I think he was the tourism minister in East Jerusalem. And we hadn't given any forewarning of why they would have done that. We didn't explain why it happened in the bulletins that day either, and we certainly didn't carry the PFLP's statement. So again, even there in terms of he said, she said, they weren't, the BBC wasn't doing their job. I mean, the fact is that there's not an equivalence afforded by news groups like the BBC between occupiers and occupied. I mean, for people who have a basic grounding in international law. There shouldn't be anyway. But for the BBC, the occupiers are Democrats and the occupied are terrorists. And so there's a subtext that they deserve whatever they've got coming. Whenever I mean, that's a subtext. It's not said openly, but whenever Palestinian lobbyists got through the switchboard to editors on the shows I was working on, they were usually hung up on, or they were treated with disdain. And I could talk about this for a long time, but perhaps we don't have the time for it. In terms of how is language was your second question, how has language been used to minimize justifying or justify Israel's actions?
Yes. How is the language used by major news platforms contributed to minimizing or justifying Israel's actions?
Okay, well, we've all seen, the absence of attribution or a reluctance to attribute when Israel kills Palestinians. On the other hand, we've seen a casting of doubt on the destruction and deaths those attacks cause. Aspersions cast on figures coming out from the Hamas-run health ministry. Memory holding of international law. I mean, there's been so many examples, but I remember there was some research close to the beginning of, um, I think it was just January, February 2024 by the Glasgow University Media Group. They found that in a 4-week period, BBC journalists used the terms murder, murderous, mass murder, brutal murder, merciless murder. I think it was 52 times to describe Israeli deaths, but they didn't use it once for Palestinian deaths, even when at that point, I think there were 10 or 20 times more Palestinian deaths. And similar bias existed in the use of the words massacre, slaughter, and atrocity. It again is there's no equivalence for Israeli and Palestinian lives. Another study found that Palestinians received one mention for every two Palestinian deaths, while Israelis got 8 mentions for every single Israeli death. Um, there are I mean there's difference between the broadsheets and like the Guardian or the Independent or something and the tabloids. I mean there's typically or there was certainly under Biden a tendency by the broadsheets to report overbriefed US démarches on attempts by Blinken to de-escalate or calm tensions, and simultaneously a sort of you know inability to focus on effects of war subsidies that Washington was providing, or military intervention that the UK was providing through its flights from Cyprus. And all of this helped to enable the conflict. It was consequential. Headlines like, Israel expresses regret for unintended harm or to civilians, or, Israel says it's scaling down the Gaza war. I mean, it all takes at face value um, what Israel's press office is saying. And Israel's press office, at the beginning of the war, had 200 people working effectively on propaganda, on disinformation, and those people weren't reported on, but they set the news agenda because a lot of journalists were very frightened of not of their careers being stuffed, and a lot of journalists' careers have been stuffed by actually standing up for proper news reporting, for principled reporting in this respect. I mean, information is a front in this war. That's why you have routine military censorship in Israel by the IDF on the weapons their forces use. You're not allowed to use security cabinet leaks unless they're official. Can't report about hostages. It's also, that's also why we have the mass killing of Gazan journalists. And that's something else we don't talk about, and communication strategies that support attacks on hospitals and other civilian areas. And I think increasingly, as journalists, we should be talking about whether or not we should be boycotting the Israeli government press office when they kill Gazan journalists. And I'm actually rather unhappy that my union's not doing that. But that's something which is more sort of shop talk, I suppose. I hope that sort of adds something to the questions.